bonsoir, bienvenue à tous. Vous m'entendez? Ça marche? OK. Donc, bienvenue à cette conférence. Donc, conférence spéciale, en fait, ce soir, une conférence qui est organisée, en fait, par les membres du projet de recherche Habiter le Nord. Donc, un projet de recherche important à l'école qui est, en fait, dirigé de main de maître par Geneviève Vachon, n'est-ce pas? Et qui inclut plusieurs de vos professeurs et plusieurs chercheurs et co-chercheurs, autant au Québec qu'au Canada. Donc, avant que je passe la parole à Denise, qui va venir présenter plus en détail les conférenciers de ce soir, je vais prendre une petite minute de votre temps, tout simplement pour remercier nos commanditaires. Donc, toujours très important de le faire. Donc, d'abord, le Musée de la civilisation, et en particulier, donc, Martin Leblanc et toute son équipe, qui nous accueillent, en fait, de façon très chaleureuse à chaque fois. Et j'en profite pour, puisqu'on est au musée, prenez le temps d'aller voir l'exposition qui est sur la passerelle, qui s'appelle « J'habite la ville », n'est-ce pas? Je ne l'ai pas raté. Et non « Habiter le Nord ». Donc, on habite beaucoup ce soir, vous allez voir. Donc, prenez le temps avec un petit verre de vin à la fin sur la passerelle, ça vaut la peine. Donc, on remercie aussi, bien sûr, la Ville de Québec, la Faculté et l'École d'architecture de l'Université Laval, et deux nouveaux commanditaires aussi cette année. En fait, la plateforme web de diffusion des idées architecturales au Québec, donc collectif, et aussi Tremco, donc qui sont à l'origine, en fait, des conférences BEST. Donc, c'est 4 conférences financées par Tremco à chaque année, qui abordent les thèmes précis, donc du bâtiment, de l'écologie, de la science et de la technologie. Donc, voilà, sans plus tarder, je vous laisse entre les mains de Denise pour la suite. Bonne soirée.
Je ne reconnais pas beaucoup de visages dans la salle, mais j'ai été longtemps la vieille de l'école. J'ai pris ma retraite il y a 2 ans et comme je disais tantôt, je connaissais vraiment tout le monde à l'école, mais maintenant, je vois beaucoup de visages nouveaux, ce qui est toujours intéressant. En tout cas, j'imagine que les profs qui sont à l'école doivent avoir un grand plaisir avec tous vous autres. Alors, vous allez m'excuser, mais je n'ai pas l'habitude de présenter les gens en lisant des notes. Je vais essayer de le faire le moins possible. Mais Geneviève et moi, on a passé beaucoup d'heures sur la route depuis 2 jours, et dû à l'ouragan Matthews dans l'est du pays. Alors, je vais plutôt regarder un peu mes notes. Alors, nos 2 invités de ce soir sont des architectes, sont aussi des professeurs à l'Institut d'Urbanisme et du paysage, qui est une sous-section de l'École d'architecture et de design d'Oslo, qui est une très grande école d'architecture très, très reconnue. Et pour les étudiants qui ne sauraient pas où est Oslo, c'est en Norvège, évidemment. Et ils sont chercheurs au Centre d'études urbaines et paysagères d'Oslo aussi. Vous irez voir, l'acronyme est assez joli, c'est OCULS, OCULS, et ils ont un très, très beau site web. Donc, vous irez voir plus en détail tout ce qui se fait en Norvège, notamment sur les questions nordiques, mais sur toutes sortes d'autres questions qui vous intéressent. Alors, on va avoir des conférenciers en tandem. On a 2 conférenciers ce soir. D'abord, Lisbet Harboe. Et là, vous allez m'excuser, mon norvégien n'est pas très bon non plus. S'intéresse tout particulièrement aux pratiques urbaines et au travail des firmes d'architecture contemporaine sous l'angle de leur vision sociale. Alors, elle a fait une thèse de doctorat sur toutes ces firmes qui, je sais, vous intéressent beaucoup, comme Stalker en Italie, et il y en a toute une série d'autres, architecture autogérée à Paris. Donc, des firmes qui travaillent dans des perspectives sociales, qui essayent d'amener l'architecture chez les gens, en interaction avec les gens, mais qui accordent aussi beaucoup d'importance à l'espace et au design. Elle a étudié particulièrement 3 grandes firmes européennes qui travaillent dans cette perspective-là, et je ne les nommerai pas. Elle pourra peut-être vous les nommer lors de la période de questions. Peter Hemmersam, lui, est danois. Il a fait ses études d'architecture à Russe. Moi, je le prononce comme ça, mais il m'a dit « au russe ». C'est ça? Au Danemark, où il a été associé à une firme d'architecture assez intéressante. Ça aussi, vous irez voir le site web qui s'appelle Transform, qui est aussi localisé dans cette ville. Il a fait un doctorat sur les centres commerciaux, et ça, j'ai trouvé ça très drôle parce que vous ne savez sans doute pas, mais Jeanne Pierrot-Moretti, le directeur de l'école, a aussi fait sa thèse de doctorat sur les centres commerciaux. Et donc, c'est une rareté en architecture, 2 personnes qui se rencontrent sur un sujet similaire. Il y a aussi Olivier Vallerand, qui, je pense, est chargé de cours à l'école, je ne suis pas sûre, mais qui a travaillé sur le même sujet. Il est associé aussi au Centre d'art et d'environnement du Nevada Museum of Art aux États-Unis. Peter s'intéresse bien sûr au design urbain. Ce qui est intéressant, c'est qu'il cherche à théoriser le lien entre diverses préoccupations actuelles et le design urbain, soit la ville verte, la mobilité, les médias sociaux. Et ça l'amène à publier beaucoup. Sa liste de publications est très impressionnante. Mais ce qui est intéressant, c'est qu'il publie sur le terrain qu'il fait, sur le travail qu'il fait avec les étudiants, mais aussi d'un point de vue de critique d'architecture. Et ça, c'est peut-être plus rare d'associer ces 3 volets-là ensemble. Alors, le projet Habiter le Nord, qui vient d'être nommé, vient tout juste d'organiser un symposium à Terre-Neuve. C'est pour ça qu'on a eu l'ouragan sur le dos. Et ce symposium portait sur l'identité inuite, l'habitation, les agglomérations et le paysage au Nunangat, c'est-à-dire dans toute la région où il y a des Inuits à travers le monde. Donc, ce n'est pas juste au Canada où il y a des Inuits. Alors, c'est dans ce contexte-là que le projet de recherche a invité Peter et Lisbet à venir présenter quelque chose à l'intérieur de ce symposium. On leur a demandé de faire une petite extension sur Québec, ce qu'ils ont accepté avec beaucoup de plaisir. Ce qu'on a découvert, c'est qu'un des grands projets de recherche sur lequel ils travaillent, recherche en architecture et design urbain, s'appelle Future North. Et il travaille sur les questions d'industrialisation du Nord, d'urbanisation du Nord et de certains des impacts que ça a sur les populations locales. Alors, je pense que c'est intéressant pour vous autres de faire des joints avec ce qui se passe aussi au Québec et qui se passe bien, bien loin de nous, au Nunavik. Vous avez tous entendu parler du Plan Nord. Or, le Plan Nord, c'est un grand projet d'industrialisation du Nord, donc l'industrie extractive et toutes les infrastructures que ça implique, les routes, les ports, etc., les aéroports. Et tout ça se fait parfois en consultation avec les populations inuites qui habitent là depuis des milliers d'années, qui ont vécu dans des conditions extrêmes et qui se sont adaptées. Alors, je pense que ça va être intéressant de regarder cet élément du travail qui se fait en Norvège sur l'industrialisation et l'urbanisation du Nord. Alors, ça peut expliquer en partie un des thèmes sur lesquels les 2 travaillent, c'est l'hybridité de l'urbanisme, donc la rencontre entre différentes forces qui s'entrecroisent, et je pense qu'on va en entendre parler ce soir. Il y a une autre chose qui nous amène à travailler, en tout cas à vouloir travailler avec eux, c'est qu'ils travaillent un petit peu comme on fait à l'école. Ils travaillent de façon très, très étroite avec les étudiants dans les communautés. Donc, il y a là quelque chose d'assez intéressant. C'est une question de soulever les questions de recherche, des nouvelles questions à partir du travail qui se fait avec tous vous autres. Alors, là-dessus, sans plus tarder, Place-Specific Arctic Urbanism. Merci.
Thank you. I think we have been thoroughly introduced. Thank you for inviting us. It's fantastic to be here. We feel extremely warmly received, so thank you very much for that. We have had a wonderful day here. What we are going to talk about today is the research and combined with educational work that we have done in primarily the European Arctic, but also in other places. We feel that we have a lot in common with some of the work that is done here in areas of the North, and particularly the interaction between educational activities, and the place development in smaller communities in the north. So we feel that there's a great sort of shared agenda that we think we can probably elaborate on during today and afterwards. But we start the talk with my colleague Lisbet giving a short introduction.
Yeah. Hello, nice to be here. We start, the Arctic is urbanizing. This urbanization is not only due to economic and demographic processes. It's also one that reflects cultural evolutions, changing values, and lifestyle choices. For decades, little attention has been paid to the actual urbanism and design of cities in the region. The urbanism and planning in the Arctic today has to capture contemporary cultures, values, and lifestyles in each specific place. We argue that the planning of Arctic cities still largely happens within the modernist master planning framework, as you see. This framework is based on an idea of preset or standardized master provision of urban services, dwellings, healthy urban layouts, social and educational facilities, and also on a division of urban environments and landscapes. The tension between colonial modernization, as expressed through urban planning, and indigenous ways of life is evident in many Arctic cities. Beyond theory and political debate, the practices of everyday life reveal a variety of hybrids between these apparent polarities. This is the issue we will address today, specifically looking at Longyearbyen in Svalbard and Tasiilaq in Greenland. Debates on Arctic communities have for many years been dominated by anti-urban identity discourses based on the dichotomy between colonial modernization and indigenous ways of life. As a result, local population have had little room for re-evaluating the design of their cities as contemporary urban environments. Such place-specific approaches reflect these place-specific approaches that we're working on reflect Dorian Massey's notions of place as not being fixed or spatially bounded. Within a community, people have different conceptions of place, constructing a diverse sense of place. Based on such a notion of place, we are interested in the processes that enable a meaningful co-creation of the place, rather than the reductive modernist fabrication of space. And with this, I'll give the word to Peter.
Thank you. So what we will do today, after Lisbet's introduction, that kind of sets the stage for our work towards developing concepts and doing research. We will explain how we go about that through doing educational work. We have worked in several places in the Arctic, and as is illustrated here on this map, we have worked in Greenland, in Tasiilaq. We have worked in Svalbard, in Longyearbyen, and the next semester after Christmas we will have a studio on the Russian-Norwegian border. There are cities on both sides who will work kind of on both these situations. What is important to understand about the Arctic is, of course, that it's a big place. You probably are aware of that. About 40% of the Arctic is Canadian, another 40% of the Arctic is Russian, and the rest is shared between the US, Greenland, and Norway. There are many ways of defining the Arctic. This is a map of temperatures in July, average temperatures, and that gives you some idea about how the Arctic is often defined. There are many other ways of defining the Arctic. It can be politically defined. It can be defined by botanical features, but it can also be defined by social development indexes. And in many ways, our idea of how we address the Arctic is based on how cities are conceptualized, which relates in many ways to how they are lived as social spaces. What is important to know, of course, is that the Arctic is not empty. Within this circle drawn here, you have a population of roughly 4 million people. So sort of contrary to most people's idea of the Arctic being vast and almost entirely unpopulated, the inverse is actually true. Of course, these 4 million people are not distributed equally around this space. They are concentrated in specific nodes, and specifically the European Arctic is much more urbanized than the rest, due primarily to the Gulf Stream, which makes it possible for us to live in Norway, so we're quite happy about that. When we start our discussion of urbanism in the Arctic, we do that with the intention of trying to, as Lisbet said, work out other ways of approaching the specific conditions in the Arctic. What we find is that there are very specific and particular ideas of the architecture and urbanism in the Arctic that seems to persevere and seems to be located and rediscovered and replicated across the different parts of the Arctic. We argue that part of the reason for this is that the Arctic largely still is perceived in a colonial perspective. It's largely still seen, described by policymakers and experts from an outside perspective. I know people here are trying very hard to develop alternative perspectives to that, trying to find ways in which local populations can articulate their own visions and versions of urbanism, and it's a very similar track that we are following in our work. This is probably the most iconic image of Arctic urbanism. It's done by British-Swedish architect Ralph Erskine, who is well known across the Arctic, both in Canada and in Scandinavia, and was also active in both this region in developing visions of the North. To us, he is a very important person because he still, in many ways, is seen as the Arctic architect. Whenever anyone outside the Arctic thinks of what Arctic architecture and urbanism is, this is most likely the image that pops up, the reference that most people will be familiar with. This is an illustration of Erskine's project in northern Canada, Resolute Bay, the project that he worked on design for. This was in a rather remote location in the very north of the country, where a military presence was seen to be important during the Cold War. In order to support this military base, or rather perhaps to legitimize a kind of continued presence there, a city was planned. Problem was that they didn't really have any population, so a number of Inuits were forcibly moved from one location to this rather remote location, and Erskine was designated the architect who was supposed to design this city for the local population. It turned out to be a rather disastrous endeavor. Erskine tried to have dialogues with the local population, but in the end, this kind of pretty grand vision of a climate-protected city sort of stranded. It was way too far from the sea, from the Inuits, to actually go to the sea which they had to do every day to fish and hunt. His image of this city, nevertheless, sort of stuck in the minds of architects. This is the kind of illustrations that he did. This is the city center of his city, and it's a relatively well-known type of architecture. But as you can see here, it's populated in this particular image by Inuit. The notion of architecture that Erskine developed was one of architectural modernism, in which contextual negotiation was highlighted. So it was really, in many ways, a kind of renegotiated type of modernism in which form resulted directly from climate and function. The kind of rationale here, which kind of proves perhaps that Erskine is still in many ways a modernist, is that he looks at the environment, particularly the physical dimensions of the environment, as something that can be analyzed, described, and addressed by architecture. He does the same thing with society. So he represents a specific era in architectural thinking where both the physical environment, the functionality of the city could be designed in ways that would also answer to structural conditions of society. So society was also something that could be studied through scientific methods. His position, I think, sort of becomes quite clear in this quote that we found. It has become apparent that there is a need to find an indigenous culture and method of life, of modern life, in this untried region. What he's talking about here is not the indigenous population's way of life. No, he's talking about that scientifically developed approach to Arctic living that is the result of scientific analysis of the physical environment and of society. It has to be a new one that the expert from the south, in this case from Europe, was there to kind of bring out in the local context. Erskine's model of architecture is quite well known, I think also here. He was very preoccupied with how architecture could help facilitate social space development in cities. For him, cities had the mission of bringing people together. They were supposed to supply social spaces and meeting places, and the architecture was there to support this function. So the architecture was designed to facilitate meeting by alleviating the climate, creating favorable microclimates. He developed this model of buildings that did that, facing south, sheltering from the winds, creating favorable microclimates on one side. This is his project from Svalbard in northern Sweden, a rather big building in a mining community that does exactly that. Here's a version of the same thing, not designed by Erskine, but he was a consultant on this project in northern Quebec, in Vermont. This giant 1.3 kilometer structure houses all the communal functions of the city. So you'll find the shopping center, the swimming pool, the skating rink. Everything is kind of put in there to kind of bring up the volume. So it actually gives this kind of sheltering effect. And it does actually work. I was there in winter, and when you step out there, it's noticeably warmer on one side than the other. You could then argue that it's a rather big gesture to build a 1.3 kilometer building in order to get a few degrees warmth on one side of the building. And I think for me that kind of illustrates perhaps a kind of slightly kind of monomanic aspect of such an architecture. It does one thing. It deals with a specific aspect of the environment and works with that through the architecture. But you can, of course, ask, okay, with the other things that could be more important to address in this issue. I jump again to another country where we find another version of Erskine's architecture, big architecture. This is a particular example is from Arctic Norway, from Hammerfest, designed by the architects Astrup and Helland, a horse-shaped shoe block creating a sheltered space towards the mountain against the winds coming in from the Barents Sea. This is the kind of background that we are entering into, an idea amongst architects, many architects, about what Arctic architectures and Arctic urbanism is and what it does, what it looks like. We try to, through our research and through our educational practice with students, to find other ways of working that can perhaps work to supplement this kind of predominant idea of what an Arctic architecture and urbanism is. Specifically, we want to make it clear that there are not just one urbanism for the Arctic. There are in fact a number of competing and collaborating and overlapping ways of thinking about urbanism in the Arctic. Specifically, we have done this in a series of studios with students. We have traveled to places in the Arctic, worked with them in different contexts, and through their mapping, research, and design development, we have arrived at certain ways of looking at places and place-specific urbanism. The first studio we did was in the town of Tasiilaq on the east coast of Greenland. The east coast of Greenland is the far side. Most of the people in Greenland lived on the west side, but there is a small population on the east coast of Greenland who, to make it even worse, speak a slightly different type of Greenlandic that they spoken on the west coast. Tasiilaq is a city of around 2,000 people. It is blocked. The passage to the city is blocked 7 months a year, so you have to bring provisions in during the summer month in big containers, store them on the harbor, and kind of open the containers one by one as you get hungrier. It is also a fast-growing city, which is perhaps rather surprising. There are many reasons for this. One of the things is that Greenland, like Nunavik, has a young population, lots of kids being born. So it's a town full of children. It's also the place where smaller people from the smaller settlements on the east coast of Greenland migrate to. So it's actually growing. That means it has a housing shortage, like we've heard in Nunavik, is also an issue. It is a city that still largely, not largely, but to a large extent relies on hunting and fishing. So even though it's an urban community of 2,000, hunting and fishing is more present here than in many of the cities on the west coast. It also is a tourism base. You will find cruise ships docking here once in a while, and it's used as a base for the more and more common trans ice cap journeys, where people start here, walk across the ice cap of Greenland on skis, and sort of emerge somewhere on the west coast. Greenland is a country under change. As you are probably aware, it is the biggest Inuit country in the world. It is semi-autonomous, moving slowly towards greater and greater autonomy from Denmark. It has a population around 50,000, and it's undergoing change in many ways connected to economy and political development, but also cultural development. The economy of the country is primarily based on fishing, but there has been moves towards mining and resource extraction to support full political independence. There is a set of negotiations going on, both internally in the country, but also abroad, about the relationship to Denmark and to the rest of the world, and not least to Canada. There's also an ongoing renegotiation of the identity of the country and of the inhabitants of the country. There's a move from thinking, at least amongst the younger population, the most educated part of the population, of thinking about themselves as, or rather thinking of themselves as a community made out of Inuit, to a community of Greenlanders. And that's a rather significant shift, because the ethnic perspective then becomes sort of dissociated from an idea of a national population. And that's a rather significant kind of cultural shift that is happening these years in Greenland. We have been working in Tasiilaq in collaboration with the planning agency of this particular municipality. The capital of this municipality is in Nuuk on the west coast, so it's a few thousand kilometers away, and the planner, Rune Christensen here, flew in to meet us. He was in town for many reasons, to help us, and talked about how issues in the local context can be addressed, what issues are at stake, what the possibilities are. But he was also very specifically in town to look at this particular problem that in Tasiilaq, it is a community where skidoos are not allowed for hunting. All hunting happens on dog sledges, so there are about 3 times as many dog sledges as there are cars in this town, and the population of dogs is approximately the same as the population of people. That, of course, sort of creates tensions in a city that is, of course, partly relying on traditional cultures of hunting, but it's also at the same time transforming into a modern contemporary urban setting. So conflicts emerge when these dogs are located really close to where people live, and they bark all night, and they smell, and it's quite annoying. So he was specifically in town to find out, and that's one of the tasks of the Arctic urban planner, where do you put the sledge dogs? What are the obvious locations for doing that? And now we are kind of on thin territory that very few planning educations have anything significant to say about. These are the dog areas in the town. These are the existing areas, the orange areas. So they are already kind of concentrated in certain areas, but they have to be close enough to the hunters' houses so they can go to them every day to feed them. So they shouldn't be too far away. So it's a kind of balance. We have addressed this location in collaboration with the local planning agency, but also with a lot of other stakeholders in the community, ranging from both official stakeholders, but also unofficial stakeholders, culturally significant people of different types. We have mapped the material aspects of the site. We have mapped perceptual issues. We've mapped social issues. We've looked at landscape practices, and specifically we have tried to study the everyday life in this location amongst the locals. Of course, we are there for a limited amount of time with our students, but the students work collaboratively and produce a kind of shared atlas or mapping of these contexts that then informs our work. We have also been working with involving an emerging generation of local professionals. This was perhaps not the case some years ago, but there is now in Greenland a generation of professionals, often trained abroad, but also sometimes trained at the relatively young university in Greenland, who are seeing that they have a kind of mission in building the country in many ways. Specifically, we had as a guest student in our studio, Anne Ignatiusen here on the left. She is a landscape architecture student from East Greenland. So that meant that she actually spoke the local language, which was really helpful to us in our research. That also meant, of course, that she was a very kind of direct way into the community. She actually had family there and could sort of guide us towards not just speaking to the sort of notable individuals in town, but also kind of getting on the inside of everyday family life. So that was an incredible resource to have in our work. We studied the formal material culture of the site. What are the kind of formal systems that are used for housing construction, for technical infrastructure, for road construction, etc. It turns out that there's a lot of concrete used in this town to build some really, really massive foundations for the buildings. And a lot of the houses are these really well-known wooden prototypes that were developed from the 1940s, 30s and onward, by some notable Danish architects and have been used in Greenland for more than 40 years, constructed over a period of 40 years, and are now seen by Greenlanders as their local particular type of architecture. It's basically the local typology that most of Greenlanders are grown up with. We have of course also studied the informal material culture. We know that in many communities, this is an incredible source of knowledge about the actual daily life of a community. This is an example of a house, as you see, supplemented with a shipping container, a kind of remnant of the shipping operation that's involved in keeping this town running for the 7 months a year where there's no ship access. And you see you have all the kind of lifts, not the leftovers, but the kind of the elements of urban living here. You have the water hose and you have the sledge, the kids' sledge over there, but you also have the hunting sledge over there, and you have the frame for cleaning polar bear skins leaning on the lifts. So for us, that kind of gives a pretty important insight in how life is actually lived in this context. Another type of mapping is a mapping of urban life. That is a mapping of this use of urban spaces over the day by different groups who are where at what time, what type of activities are performed in urban space. Of course, in Arctic communities, you'll find that there's an enormous difference between summer and winter, but then again, I don't have to tell you about winter here. You know all about that. We find that studying urban life brings out the kind of contrasts between very traditional activities as hunting, for instance, but also very kind of contemporary everyday life that is so indistinguishable for the types of life that we would live in our own context. And that goes for this town, but it basically goes for anywhere you visit in this region. We do, of course, study the city's relationship to the landscape. The cities have landscape both sort of within their boundaries, but also beyond. And in a fishing and hunting community like Tasiilaq, of course, access to the country, so to the landscape, is vitally important for the economy, and is then also in many ways part of the city's economy. What we learn is that the city is located in places where you can access different food sources. You can hunt narwhals in that long fjord there. You can fish cod out there. If you go for the bigger whales, you have to kind of move a bit out, etc. So there are different locations for different types of hunting activities. We also learn that climate change is very real here, because these blobs have actually moved over the years, and the routes you need to take to get to them, if you drive your dog sled, you have to go inland rather than over the ice, because suddenly the ice is not as strong as it was, etc. So things are very different. The life of local people is in a very, very direct way influenced by climate change. And of course, we know that nowhere is more influenced by climate change than the Arctic. One project illustrating how I think we start getting an idea about what a place-specific Arctic urbanism can be is a project here by Jack Hughes. It's a project for a Greenlandic guide training center. In our research, we found out that the education levels in this town is low. There's no possibilities of education after 10 years of school. You basically have to go somewhere else to do anything. There's also youth unemployment. There is an existing hunting culture, very much alive, and it's a hunting culture in which knowledge about hunting is transferred in the old-fashioned way from father to son, basically, but also from, of course, from mother to daughter in the kind of related activities of food preparation, berry picking, and stuff that tends to be the kind of traditional domains of ladies. The dog sleds are still in use here, very much in everyday use as hunting infrastructure. And most importantly, we find out that the city is in many ways characterized by not a lot of money, not a lot of kind of big investments going into anywhere, but lots of human resources. And Jack's program for a guide training center builds very specifically on those local resources in the terms of individuals. So individuals possess resources that can be thought of as something that can contribute to raising, not raising awareness, but creating activities and new economies in a local context. Jack's proposal for a guide training center is based on a mapping of the city and its different spatial resources. There's a gym, there's an existing harbor, there's the place where the dogs are, etc., etc. And all these places put together form the program of this education. So the physical aspects is done in the gym, the sailing is done in the harbor, etc. And the educational dimension is performed very much by the hunting, the older hunters, but also the generation of tour and tourist operators that are existing here. So building on local resources, the program is kind of dispersed over the territory, trying to make use of what is there, and trying to produce an architecture that can be managed and handled by a local architecture. He did extensive research on comparable curriculums in other parts of the Arctic, and actually proposed a specific curriculum based on the available human resources and natural possibilities, landscape possibilities in the city. You see that here on the left. It's too detailed for me to explain in practice, but you see it's basically a 4-semester program that's detailed on there on the top with summer and winter activities, and some diagrammatic ideas about how specific points in the city can be kind of improved on in order to perform that role of educating guides for a future developed tourism industry, not only in Tasiilaq, but in all of Greenland. We move on to another context. We had a studio here last year. It says 2014, that's not correct. It's 2015, sorry about that. Now we jump to Longyearbyen on Svalbard. Longyearbyen is the northernmost urban community of any size. It's located very close to the 80th parallel, so it's actually pretty far north. It's about a little more than 1,000 kilometers from the North Pole. A little less than 1,000 kilometers from the North Pole, sorry. It is a mining community in this territory of Svalbard, sometimes called Spitsbergen, which is an international territory which is under Norwegian administration. That means that anyone can go to Svalbard, set up a business. So in Svalbard you will find Longyearbyen, which is the administrative capital. This is where the governor lives. But you also, if you sail out the shore for about 3 hours, you get to Barentsburg, which is a Russian city. But it's a Russian city that has to abide by Norwegian legislation. But there's no kind of restriction for anyone going there setting up a business. If you lose your income and your business collapses, you're kicked out. But if you can make your money there, you're welcome. So come on. It's a mining community. It's coal mining. You can not actually see the coal seams here, but you can see the kind of the tailings from the mines that are with the mine heads that are located high on the sides of the mountain where the coal seam is. And it's a coal seam about this wide, and it runs through a rather big section of Svalbard. And you can imagine digging out a coal seam like this in Arctic conditions, where there's no daylight about 3 months a year at all. Can be a kind of a rather hard sort of endeavor. There's a population in this town of around 2,400 people. The mining is closing down. World market prices for coal have plummeted. It's simply not profitable to mine coal anymore. Perhaps it never was. We don't know about that. But it's been important for the Norwegian state to maintain population here for the last 100 years. So even though it's been probably not making a profit, the Norwegian state has still sort of maintained mining activities here. The mine is closing down, as I mentioned, and tourism is shifting to other activities. It's shifting to tourism. There will be about 50,000 tourists coming here a year, so quite a significant number. It's also shifting to research and education. There is a university here, which you see in the kind of top right of the city, close to the sea, the big chunk there, with about 400 students and a number of researchers who are stationed here all year round. And there are different research stations located around the peninsula for doing different kinds of research. It's also the site of very ordinary urban life, even though the place does not have a permanent population. In Svalbard, there is not and there has never been an indigenous population, but there has been a European presence since the 16th century in the form of whaling and other kind of resource extraction activities. That means that the population of this town, which is built on mining, is actually not a permanent population. It's a population that turns over with about 20% a year due to the mining activities. In fact, you're not allowed to die on Svalbard. You're sent off to the mainland before you die. The town, as I said, is in a kind of transition. The shopping center you see here on the left was originally built as a changing room for the miners, but is now the shopping center of the town. Also in this location, we worked with the local planning agency, and this is the local planner, Lynn Tautra-Grønset, who's testing the terrain. And she is showing us around. In this particular case, we are looking at the local water reservoir. And as you can see, she's armed with a shotgun because of the polar bears. You're simply not allowed to venture outside the urban space without a gun in this location. We analyzed again the city in a number of ways, sort of comparable to what we did in Tasiilaq. One of the things we did here, and which is kind of interesting, you can do in a community that's not too big, is that we mapped all functions. We basically had people driving around on bicycles, looking at every door and every door sign and asking everybody what was in that particular building. And as you see here, which you can't read because I can't read it, is actually a complete list of businesses, organizations, and other programs that exist in this city. So we actually have a complete idea of what happens in this space, and as you can see, it's divided into an industrial district, a residential district, and a commercial district, and then a sort of government district on the hill. Looking very carefully at what is there is part of our approach. Also here, we mapped the formal as well as the informal material culture. Very important part of the material culture is the exposed infrastructure, the pipes that are visible above ground because of permafrost, which is a condition that I'm sure you're familiar with from the northern parts of Quebec too. But also the informal structure, which are this kind of signs again of how actual life is lived in this situation. And a significant feature here that we found, but also found in Tasiilaq and Greenland, is that sort of desire to have outdoor spaces where you can actually be for those months a year where it's pleasant enough. Because we are so far north, people tend to have terraces on the south for the sun, and then on the north for the midnight sun. That is kind of a very particular kind of complication working with architecture in this context. Snowmobiles, ski-doos are all over. They're actually the major environmental problem of the city. And they follow entirely different paths from the roads and the cars, as you can imagine is often the case in these places. This is a map showing the different types of formal and informal structures here. You see this, the different types of foundations used in different places, the water pipes, heating pipes, sewage pipes, etc. So it's a piped community. We also worked on the perceptions of the city. And here we apply an age-old tool of urbanism that I'm sure many students will have encountered at some time, doing a mental map. What do you do? Well, there are many ways of doing it, but one of them is to ask people to draw their place, to ask them to give you directions to somewhere and listen to what do they actually mention as important markers on the way, etc. And these are the types of maps that our students collected from people. And you see they're quite different in nature, but you can sort of synthesize these using Kevin Lynch approaches, and you end up with maps like this that demonstrates that the city center is the city center, which is nice to know, but also that the harbor front, the kind of the waterfront, is not really present in people's minds. That might, of course, be because for some months of the year it's an icy extent, but it actually is not something that's approached by people in their kind of mental daily life. We worked with students on these findings, combining findings into projects that deal with the architecture and the landscape and the urbanism of the place. In our students, we have a mix of students of architecture and students of landscape architecture, and we try to make projects that do many things at the same time. I'm going to show you two projects here. This is a plan of all the projects that we worked on during the semester. As you can see, we are kind of managed to disperse quite widely over the city. Some are very small, kind of condensed proposals for housing developments, but most of them have a kind of infrastructural nature, and many of them address the specific landscape as found in the context. I will start with a project that's located with the kind of green double cross that you see on the top there, which is the cable car hub. There used to be a system of cable cars connecting from the different mine heads, who, as you mentioned, were located quite far above sea level. The cable car brought buckets of coal down to the harbor, and this is the terminus where the cable car lines from the different mine heads met and were combined into one line that went down to the harbor where the coal was shipped out. It's an amazingly beautiful building. All architects love this building, and also the locals see it as their kind of local landmark in the building. And this first project is a project that deals with reinventing this infrastructure, but not for coal this time, but for tourism. I'll get back to that. This is the building as it looks like from the outside. It's an image from the inside. It's actually pretty intact as it looks today. I think you could just push a button and it would almost start. You have the buckets there. Everything is kind of left in place, so it's a frozen piece of time you enter when you enter in this building. And when you stand up there, you can kind of follow these lines out into the landscape. So you can sort of stand up there and you can see, oh, that's over to mine head 2. Whoops, that's over to mine head number 7, etc. So these lines out into landscapes. And this project reconceptualized as not as the movement of coal, but as a movement of tourists coming to the city. What happens in this city is that you have giant cruise ships docking. I say giant, they're probably bigger around here, but at least for the Arctic, they're pretty big. It's a pretty massive thing when 3,000 students, not students, students, could be students also, 3,000 tourists stream off one of these boats and kind of completely flood the city. Of course, the city doesn't really have the infrastructure. It's not designed for handling tourists. It's designed for handling miners and coal. And the ships dock in the wrong location, which is not the city center, etc., etc. So lots of projects. These two students, Phoebe and Ikepop, worked with a project where they said, okay, why don't we take this existing infrastructure for coal and reverse it, and you turn it into an infrastructure for tourists. This is a story they developed of a Chinese tourist visiting the location, moving up into the city and suddenly kind of realizing by following the industrial heritage structures from the coal mining industry, realizing and understanding the layout of the city in the landscape due to the way the infrastructure interacts with it. This is the existing structure. The cable car hub is located on the top of the hill, and there were tracks running down to the quay where it was shipped out. In the proposal over there, this movement is reversed. The cruise ships dock where the coal ships docked. The tourists come ashore. The grey building, which is today the headquarters of the mining company, is then converted into a tourism facility because mining is closing down. That's a logical thing to do. You pass through the historical and the contemporary coal power plant. You move up the hill, following the trace of coal dust on the ground that you see there, emerge at this building, and can then follow the cable car lines into the city and understand the context from there. So from being a machine that handles coal, this is now a machine that handles streams of tourists. You arrive at the pier in your boat, you go on land, you move up the stairs to the cable car hub, and from there you can sort of get a view out into the city. One more project. This is the river of Longyearbyen. It's called the Longyearbyen. It's a typical Arctic river that would flood at certain periods and be completely dry and frozen in other periods. It's a river that has not been channelized, but rather had many channels. It kind of flowed across a vast plain, which is the typical nature of Arctic rivers. In order to urbanize the space, the river has been channelized, as you can see. Basically, it happens by every year a big bulldozer driving down to it and excavating all the masses that has been washed down in the spring flood. As you can see, the city has now been built on the floodplain. What this floodplain that used to kind of be the space of the river. Problems emerge because now the river has kind of been dug down so deep, so it's now interfering with the permafrost, which is a kind of problem. And no one really knows what happens when the permafrost melts under the river. Would that suddenly mean that the river kind of floats out into spaces it's not supposed to be underground and undermines the urban structures on both sides? It's a kind of unknown, and really completely new strategies have to be developed to tackle this Arctic river in this context. Two students, Martin and Alessandra, developed a proposal for renaturalizing the river. They basically traced the original flows of the river in these little channels and proposed that a new landscape could be developed within the city. So rather than just seeing the city as something that provides access to the landscape, then the kind of perspective is turned around and the landscape within the city becomes the space of attention. There are many reasons for this. One of this is that it gives space for the river without having to channelize it. So that's kind of one thing that's solved. The other thing that it does is that it creates a landscape space that is accessible and an ecology that is accessible to people. And remember, in this town, you cannot go out of town without a gun. So if you don't have a gun, you're stuck in town. You can't go anywhere. That might be a problem for the locals, but for the 50,000 tourists coming every year, they're kind of stuck within city boundaries. They cannot go anywhere. The preservation authorities in Svalbard are very keen to preserve the landscape intact. You're not allowed to drive in it with the ATVs. You're not allowed to destroy anything. You're not allowed to move anything. If you find anything, you cannot touch it, etc. So it's very, very preserved. And in fact, the entire claim to Norwegian sovereignty over this territory is in many ways built on this idea of being the guardian of the local ecosystem and the local environment. That means that tourism is seen as the future for this town, but it's also seen as a potential threat to the environment that is actually the logic of the town. So there's a kind of inbuilt conflict. So developing a accessible landscape space within the city, accessible to tourists and locals alike, then becomes the proposal in this project. Here's a zoom in of the project. There's a restaurant and entertainment space located at this corner of the town. The school is up there. There's a proposal in the city in the project to develop a pedestrian connection from the tourist accommodation in the southern end of the city to the city center in the north. A proposal for developing a ski cross-country ski arena for the annual ski marathon that happens here every year, attracting thousands of people from the mainland, etc. So this is an accessible space to tourists and locals alike without guns. This is a visualization of that particular space in the winter season. You see the pipes and the cross-country ski connection linking the ski slope to this territory. I will end my talk by switching back to Lisbet, who will deliver a small closing statement.
So the projects here that we've shown are place-specific and we would say multidimensional. They make use of and reconceptualize existing physical and non-physical qualities. They address conflicts and potentials revealed through mapping. They seek to bring into play a multitude of identities and assets found in the city, enacting them in various ways. In developing a new Arctic urbanism, we need to move beyond the meta-narratives of industry versus environment, modernity versus aboriginality, or urban versus natural. Rather, we need to continue to explore ways to capture and express the contradictions and richness of urban life, and to evolve Arctic cities as complex, diverse places in ways that are relevant to their inhabitants. So, thank you.
Mrs. Harboe and Mr. Hemmersam, first of all, thank you for being here with us tonight. It was a pleasure to have you with us. Your lecture was of great interest for all of us, I think, and probably there is a lot of question in the assembly. So we will therefore continue with a short period of question. Maybe someone would like to begin. Otherwise, I will ask a question of mine. So I'm really intrigued by the topic of your lecture. So I will ask you this question. So in a context of communities that are living and are living, that have lived and are living a lot of cultural changes in the past and now, I'm curious to know more about the method that you use to adapt your intervention to this population that are constantly changing at high speed. Like it's a really large question, I know, but I would like to know more about how you adapt your project to the fact that people are changing so much and will be changing so much in the future.
Yeah. So returning perhaps a bit to the introduction, where we talked about place as a continued construction, and also as something that architects can address by conceptualizing ways in which locations make place to people. Locations make sense to people. Sort of working towards what Massey would call sense of place. When you kind of conceptualize it in this way, you also realize that even though populations are transient, does not mean that they do not have sense of place. And for us, it's quite important and has been sort of increasingly made obvious to us working in places like not here, but in Longyearbyen, where the population is transient. That transient does not mean that you are not place related. There's very much a sense of place there. It has a incredibly strong identity, but it's an identity that's not kind of necessarily just limited to the physical dimensions of the place. It even has a presence beyond. After you have been there, you're still part of that community of having been there. So identity extends in many ways beyond the physical boundaries, and I think that's at least part of the answer to your question, that also transient populations have citizenship to the landscape.
Thank you. Is there maybe another question in the assembly, or?
Thank you. The Greenland example, can't remember nor can pronounce the name of the village. Does the population have access to the land outside of the village? And do they have cabins? Do they have hunting grounds or places that are cherished? I'm drawing here from examples with the Inuit of Quebec, who have a lot of cabins and ways of occupying the land that are much different than what is happening within the villages. And these things are sometimes difficult to go and understand on top of understanding the way they're living in the village. So is there such an appropriation of the land in Greenland?
There's, first of all, I should say that there are no privately owned land in Greenland. It's all shared. Also, it's all commons. And they have so they share the hunting ground, and the hunting areas and fishing areas around Tasiilaq. I think it's not regulated in any kind of ways in that sense. And they don't use so much the cabins, I think, but they do use on the ice more like temporary structures in winter time. I am not sure how much these days, but that's the tradition, and they still do a bit in Tasiilaq.
And there are some smaller settlements, but they are inhabited settlements, but they would often be places also where people would go from the city to go. And in addition, there's actually a series of tourist huts being developed that you can access from the city, that are, just open places you can go and stay the night. So there are a few of those too.
Hello. We all know that in Arctic towns there are people who have grown up there and people who just come there for a short period of time. And I find that often they have contradicting objectives, or if you want to build a building for one of the two kinds, you have to use a different approach. How do you approach when you work on a project? How do you approach the fact that there are two different types of people who have conflicting objectives or values in their way of living or using the buildings?
Can I say something? I think we think there's many different kinds of people. So we approach is thinking of that not only as two groups. Also, this is more the case of Tasiilaq and Greenland, I think what you're referring to now. We look at many different people, and that means we look at, and we do not separate much. We look at the everyday of local people in the environment. And there are different professions, there's different ways of living, and we try to understand and capture these different kinds, yes. And in that case, it could be different kinds of, for example, housing, or different housing topologies would be one answer to that. But I think and it also means that we look at the city from the eyes of children. We have had every time students who map the city, the children's city, the young city, for example. So I think we go around it in a different kind of way. I don't know if you want to add there.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And we are we're quite careful, for instance, in the case of Tasiilaq, not to talk about the Inuits and the Danes, but to talk about the locals and consider this as an urban environment, a complex urban environment in which there will be contrasting notions and ideas about the future like any other urban context. So I think that's sort of the short version of our approach.
Not to say that there's not conflict, so it's not. We shouldn't try to avoid conflicts, but it's just how we try to approach this from a different angle or a different perspective.
Thank you.
I'll be a bit skeptical here and ask if you started your presentation by talking about colonialism and modernism. Your means might be different, but if the end is tourism and more invasion from the European countries, how is the research different, and how do you convince the people that the means will help them, or the ends will help them actually?
Yeah, I think that if we take the case of Tasiilaq, to be able to live there, to see a future, they need some income, and if there are more people, hunting and fishing won't be enough. Or you could move back to a village and you could continue life there, and I think you could live. It would be possible to live a very simple life with hunting and fishing, but we experience that many of the young people are not. They wanna. They are looking for more of more urban life, maybe, but maybe still be able to continue with the traditions and some of parts of the lifestyles of their parents and grandparents. So it's. So in that sense, some kinds of tourists are a problem, and a great number of them can be that. But it's also a source of. It's also a source of income. So it's a question of how can we contribute to build a kind of tourism that's relevant, not only as an income, but also as a way of also culturally. So I think that the guide school would be one example from Tasiilaq. Would be one example and a way of trying to address this.
Yeah, and perhaps returning to the previous questions, there will be conflicts about it, no doubt about it. But it's not necessarily against between us and the local environments. There probably are people in the local community who will be for tourism and others that will be against it, which is probably the case also here in Quebec City, I think.
Yeah, so you do also enter a field of always enter a field of conflict also. And that's important, I guess. Or it's not something I guess, it is important to take that into consideration. But also in Tasiilaq, for example, there's typically this is also an issue that the politicians are struggling with. How can we survive? What is our future? How do we go further? And then sources of income, jobs, education, that's a big part of it.
Well, thank you very much for the presentation. I think it offered a really good insight into what helps constitute the sense of place. I felt like most of the elements that did that were either man-made or people-oriented. And I would like to hear you about, maybe from your observations or from your experience, what were the natural elements that helped define that sense of place, if any, or if you even see a difference between those man-made or people-oriented elements and the natural elements?
There is no doubt, of course, that landscapes have agency. They do, and that's very important that we kind of recognize that and understand that, particularly when we are in contexts of change. So communities have agency, and landscapes have agency. And I think working as designers or people who are engaged in conceptualizing futures, we have to work with ways that kind of captures both and mirrors both. So some of them will be kind of very deeply rooted in geology, for example. The coal will always be part of Longyearbyen, even though it's not mined anymore. It still is both part of the history and part of a potential future of the site, that there is a economic resource here that can be exploited. So it's not a coincidence that Longyearbyen is right here, because this is where coal was available, and it will also be available in the future. So that's one kind of example of how the agency of the landscape actually is pretty significant in how you think about the future. The most significant, no, not the most, but one of the most kind of hyped future developments in this part of the Arctic, the Barents Sea, where we have been most active, is that of the opening of the Northeast Passage. You now have cargo ships sailing from Europe to Shanghai, north of Russia, which is a big thing. And that is, of course, very much a landscape-based feature, the water and the ice and the formations of them, that sort of enables an economic activities that enables an urbanism and a way of living in a specific location. So I think those are the types of things, and now I'm kind of talking perhaps a bit of the kind of macro elements of landscape, but they are at least examples of agency.
So I know that you've been on a quite busy schedule during the past days, so I will invite everyone to continue this great discussion over a nice glass of wine just here next door in the hall. Thank you very much.